Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Kinda Murdery, a true crime podcast that's mostly about murder, and always about the strange and compelling stories that arise when the path less traveled twists to darkness, and those who walk its shadows surrender to violence and moral corruption. We have a perilous journey ahead, so thank you for lending me your courage and good company. I'm Zevin Odelberg, and this is Kinda Murdery, coming to you freshly recorded, sautéed in lemon garlic butter and piping hot from finally sunny San Diego. Now I'm going to do my best Rod Serling, that's the original host of Twilight Zone, Rod Serling impression here. Imagine, if you will, bop bop bop. That was a classic fake out there because you see, Rod Serling never actually said imagine, if you will, in the Twilight Zone intro. The fact that so many people think he did, so many people by the way, including me, is a classic example of the Mandela effect. If you're not familiar with the Mandela effect, it's a social phenomenon where a large group of people all remember the same thing incorrectly, and they all remember it incorrectly in the same way. It is named after Nelson Mandela, who, after being incarcerated for 27 years for violating South Africa's racist apartheid laws, was released from prison and would become the president of South Africa in 1994, serving for 5 years and bringing about an end to apartheid. However, a bizarrely large number of people believe that Nelson Mandela was not released from prison, did not become president of South Africa, but instead died in prison. And they don't believe this as some sort of racist revisionist history, the way that certain deplorable folks think the Holocaust never happened, but rather they believe it innocently, just incorrectly. And that is why the Mandela effect is called the Mandela effect. Other famous examples of this would be the Berenstain as opposed to Berenstain, the second one being the correct one, Bears, the Berenstain Bears, which I also remembered as being the Bernstein Bears myself, but it's Berenstain, S-T-A-I-N Bears. And of course, right back where we started, so many people, and again I was one of them, thought for sure that the Twilight Zone intro started with imagine, if you will. Well, it doesn't, and it never did. However, there was different intro copy for different seasons of the Twilight Zone. And the closest that Serling ever comes to saying imagine, if you will, is in the intro to seasons 4 and 5 of the Twilight Zone, where he says, well, you know what? I don't have to tell you. Let's take a listen to what he says. This is the season 4 intro to the original Twilight Zone.
You unlock this door with the key of imagination. Beyond it is another dimension. A dimension of sound. A dimension of sight. A dimension of mind. You're moving into a land of both shadow and substance, of things and ideas. You've just crossed over into the Twilight Zone.
So there you go. So many of us, including me, remember that starting with imagine, if you will, when in fact it says you unlock this door with the key of imagination. And that is a great example of the Mandela effect. Now, to intro today's story, I'm going to do my very best Rod Serling impression, but in deference to the Mandela effect and my own incorrect memory, I'm going to start mine with, you guessed it, imagine, if you will. Alright, here we go. Imagine, if you will, a loving husband wrongly accused and convicted of his wife's murder. Now, tilt the prism just a bit. This time, imagine a loving husband, wrongly accused and found innocent of his wife's murder. But these are not the only iterations, are they? Tilt the prism again, and we have a seemingly loving husband, secretly seething, justly accused and convicted of his wife's murder. And again, the same man, justly accused, but found innocent. Each of these create 4 very different paths in the time stream, and indeed, there are reality-altering consequences no matter which of these 4 you choose. But what if those 4 husbands, the loving, the seething, the innocent, and the murderer, not only existed, what if they existed not once, but twice? And what if all 4 men were in fact the same man, and this same man, the innocent and the guilty, the killer and the wrongly accused, lived not in some Twilight Zone, but instead in our very own reality, and lived, in fact, until as recently as 2019. Well, they did. He did. And his name was Claus von Bulow. And if you'd like to find out more, I suggest you come with me into the Kinda Murdery Zone for the Twilight Zone killer, Claus von Bulow. Claus von Bulow was born Claus Cecil Borberg in Copenhagen, Denmark on August 11, 1926. He was the son of Jonna and Sven Borberg. His parents divorced when he was 4 years old. There was always something of the night about Claus Cecil Borberg. His father, a theater critic, was arrested in Denmark as a Nazi collaborator when World War II ended. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison, released on appeal after he served 18 months, and then died a year later. During the early years of the war, young Claus was spirited out of Denmark by way of Sweden and sent to Britain to live with his mother, who had taken up residence there. He adopted the name of his maternal grandfather, Fritz Bulow, a former Danish minister of justice. The von, usually used only by members of noble families, was added later. Claus told his attorney, Mr. Alan Dershowitz, that it was his wife who had insisted that he add the von to his name. Claus entered Cambridge University in 1942 at the age of 16 and graduated in 1946 with a law degree. He then spent a year in Paris attending classes at the School of Political Science, and on his return to London, he worked in banking before joining the law offices of Quinton Hogg, a noted British barrister who later became Lord Hailsham, which is probably pronounced Hailsham. If anybody's listening across the pond, please feel free to reach out and correct me. kindamurdery@gmail.com or at Kinda Murdery on all social media, or you can call 888-MURDERY and tell me your Kinda Murdery story so that I can make sure that it inspires an episode of the show. Alright, back to Claus von Bulow. After receiving the law degree from Cambridge University in 1946, von Bulow stayed in London and worked in a variety of roles for American oil tycoon J. Paul Getty, whose base of operations was in the British capital. During this time, Mr. von Bulow, a charming and handsome man with a military bearing, became a highly visible social figure in London, while living with his mother in a fashionable apartment in Belgrave Square. Von Bulow remained with Mr. Getty, one of the world's richest men, for 20 years, until his marriage in 1966 to Martha Crawford von Auersperg. Her father, George Crawford, was the founder of the Columbia Gas and Electric Company, and it was said at the time that her annual income was in the neighborhood of $3.5 million. Barely a year before marrying Claus, she had divorced her previous husband, Prince Alfred von Auersperg of Austria. Alongside the newly minted Mrs. von Bulow, Claus settled into a palatial Fifth Avenue apartment. He stopped working, and she began looking for oceanfront property in Newport, where her mother, Annie Laurie Crawford Aiken, and stepfather, Russell Aiken, had an estate. Martha bought Clarendon Court, a Georgian mansion set on 10 acres overlooking the sea, which had been used as the house of the character played by Grace Kelly in the 1956 film High Society. It was on this property that Martha von Bulow was found in a coma, not once, but twice. In 1978, Claus began an affair with Alexandra Isles, a socialite and actress. Shortly before Christmas, Martha von Bulow's maid heard Martha, Mrs. von Bulow, moaning from behind a locked door. She would later testify that Claus refused to call a doctor as his wife sank into a coma. Claus said he thought his wife was sleeping. When Martha von Bulow was later admitted to Newport Hospital, tests indicated a high level of insulin in her system. Almost a year later, at the same time around Christmas, December 21st, 1980, Mr. von Bulow was again found unconscious and taken to the hospital in a coma. This time, Klaus's stepchildren, the two von Auersperg children, consulted Richard Koo, a former Manhattan district attorney, and hired him to investigate the circumstances of both coma episodes. Martha von Bulow, also known as Sunny, would remain in a coma for the rest of her life, passing away in 2008. And as just mentioned, her two older children, Prince Alexander von Auersperg and Alla Isham, née Princess Annie Laurie von Auersperg-Knessel. Whoa, I'm sure I butchered that, but what the heck. Her children from the first marriage to Austria's Prince Alfred von Auersperg, they both suspected foul play. They hired investigators, including Richard Koo, and those investigations led to a murder charge for Klaus. During Klaus von Bulow's first murder trial, his mistress, Miss Alexandra Isles, took the stand for the prosecution and admitted that she'd given Klaus an ultimatum about dissolving his marriage. Also brought into the testimony was the fact that a divorce would have voided the $14 million that Klaus would have inherited under his wife's will and left him with an annual income of $120,000 from a trust she'd established before their marriage. Klaus himself admitted that divorce had been discussed, but he'd said the issue had not been another woman. His wife, he said, did not mind his having an affair as long as he was discreet. Klaus maintained that their main difference had been over Mrs. von Bulow's objection to his desire to return to work. In addition to Klaus's mistress, another principal prosecution witness against him was Maria Schrahlhammer, Martha von Bulow's maid. As I already mentioned, Maria testified that shortly before Christmas in 1979, she'd heard Martha, Sunny von Bulow, moaning behind a locked door and that Klaus had refused to call a doctor. He countered that he thought his wife was simply sleeping. The maid went on to testify that she found a small black bag containing syringes, yellow paste, and white powder in a closet in Mr. von Bulow's study, and that she'd given that bag to Martha von Bulow's eldest daughter, who had the contents analyzed. It was determined that the paste was a form of Valium and that the powder was Seconal. Seconal is a powerful barbiturate, a sleeping medication that's mostly illegal now because it's just too dangerous. Miss Schrahlhammer, the maid, also said that she later found insulin in the same bag. As for Klaus, he maintained that even before he met his wife, she had entered a world of pills and alcohol. It was the defense's contention that Martha, Sunny von Bulow, had caused her own comas, either deliberately or inadvertently, by injecting herself or by swallowing insulin or barbiturates, and that the closet in which the bag was found was shared by the couple. In fact, at Klaus von Bulow's eventual appeal trial, his lawyer, Alan Dershowitz, would state that famed writer Truman Capote, a friend of Mrs. von Bulow's, had told him being Alan Dershowitz, that Sunny was, quote, an expert at injections. But at this first trial, prosecutors succeeded in arguing that von Bulow had poisoned his wife on both occasions, the time she'd gone into a coma in 1979 and again in 1980, with insulin injections, and Klaus von Bulow was sentenced to 30 years in prison. He was incarcerated on $1 million bail, which was quickly paid, and it was presumed by all that the Getty family put up the money. Klaus appealed, and the appeal, masterminded by Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz, was successful and paved the way for a new trial. Throughout his various legal travails, Klaus von Bulow always had the support of Cosima von Bulow, his daughter with Sunny, and that support never wavered. After his successful appeal, with the aid of Alan Dershowitz, Klaus von Bulow was represented at his second trial in Providence, Rhode Island, by Thomas Puccio, a former United States attorney, and he was acquitted of all charges in 1985. In his best-selling book, Reversal of Fortune, published in 1986, Alan Dershowitz recounted his role in aiding Mr. von Bulow. He began the book with a quote from a prosecutor involved. Said the prosecutor, "This case has everything. It has money, sex, drugs. It has Newport, New York, and Europe. It has nobility. It has maids, butlers, and a gardener." Indeed, the von Bulow case became one of the most publicized legal contests in the second half of the 20th century. Television offered gavel-to-gavel coverage of the trials, and Alan Dershowitz's book became the basis for a popular 1990 film of the same name, directed by Barbet Schroeder, and starring Jeremy Irons in an Oscar-winning performance as Klaus von Bulow, Glenn Close as his wife, Martha, or Sonny, von Bulow, and Ron Silver as Alan Dershowitz. After his acquittal, Klaus's stepdaughter, Princess Annie Laurie, would say that despite the verdict, quote, "We know and he knows that he tried to murder our mother." Mr. von Bulow said his stepchildren were misguided, but added that he had no feelings of vindictiveness. The children then filed a $56 million civil suit against him. It was settled in 1987 with the stipulation that Mr. von Bulow agreed to divorce their comatose mother and not to discuss the case publicly. Also settled at the same time was a suit instituted by Cosima von Bulow-Pavancelli, who was the biological daughter of Klaus and Martha von Bulow. As mentioned, she supported her father through his trials, and in her suit, she claimed that family members had exerted undue influence in turning her grandmother against her. That grandmother was Sonny von Bulow's mother, Mrs. Aiken, who had died in 1984, and her will denied Cosima any share of the $100 million estate. In the settlement, Mr. von Bulow renounced all claims to his wife's fortune in return for his daughter receiving an equal share of Mrs. Aiken's estate with her half-sister and half-brother, the Prince and Princess of Austria. Although Sonny was still in a coma and would remain so until her death in 2008, the von Bulows were legally divorced in 1988. The Manhattan apartment and the Newport mansion were turned over to the von Osberg children, and Mr. von Bulow returned to London, where he made his home until his death in 2019. But after his acquittal, Mr. von Bulow remained a welcome figure at many Manhattan social events and Broadway opening nights. A-list hosts like Carolyn and Ronaldo Herrera relied on him to create dinner party chemistry. Klaus is a great catalyst, Mr. Herrera said. People instantly loathe him or like him. Mr. von Bulow was not unaware of his notoriety, but he could also remark on the vicissitudes of fortune. Now, after all this unpleasantness, he once confided to Alan Dershowitz, "I always get the best table." A taste for the social whirl never left von Bulow, who spent his later years in a flat not far from Harrods in London. There was a party at a restaurant in Knightsbridge in the mid-90s on the night that Reversal of Fortune first aired on British television. Klaus reveled not only in the attention but also in the tabloid gossip column sightings that appeared the following day. A family friend reiterated that the support Cosima felt for her father was unwavering, saying, "He raised a marvelous woman, full of integrity, loyal but with her eyes open, who unwaveringly thought the world of him." The back-to-back trials may have divided both public opinion and the opinion of Klaus's International Society friends, but Cosima remained steadfast. As for the Society friends, some of them continued to embrace the handsome, charming European, while others shunned him as a murderer. "We would see Klaus at Mortimer's," the publicist Paul Wilmot said recently. "People used to point at him. He was a tourist attraction." In recent years, acquaintances had described Klaus as ill and mostly keeping to his own apartment. But in those intervening years, from 1988 when he moved back to London until he passed in 2019, Klaus von Bulow relished his celebrity. His morbid humor was legendary. He once quipped that when visiting New York, quote, "I always stay with my old friend Frank Campbell," which was a reference to the Upper East Side undertaker known for his society funerals. Among those who continued to support him were late 20th century society fixtures like Mercedes Kellogg, now Bass, Doris Duke, and Catherine Guinness. Less enamored was Tina Brown, the former editor-in-chief of Vanity Fair magazine, who described Klaus von Bulow in her published diaries as a, quote, "dark bastard. I'd love to see him nailed," unquote. Despite her personal enmity, Tina Brown, in one of her most famous stunts, put Klaus on the cover of Vanity Fair during his trial, saying, "Only Helmut," that's Helmut Newton, the famed photographer, "could persuade a man on trial for murder to look in his closet and choose an S&M flavored black zip-up leather jacket," Brown wrote. "He looks positively satanic." And if you're curious to see exactly what Klaus von Bulow looked like in that black leather jacket, check out Kinda Murdery's social media, Instagram, Twitter, or TikTok, at Kinda Murdery. I'll post the picture. Indeed, Klaus von Bulow was a compelling enough, charismatic enough presence to haunt the diaries and writings of famed contemporaries beyond just Tina Brown. As mentioned, he's the subject of Alan Dershowitz's best-selling book, and he also appears in the New York Diaries of Andy Warhol, where he's noted attending parties from 1978 till just a month before the artist's death, when Warhol introduced him to Bob Dylan at Nell's nightclub in January of 1987. Warhol quotes von Bulow as saying to him, "Thank you for being nice to me before I was a star." Claus von Bulow, the Danish-born man about society who in 2 trials was convicted and later acquitted of twice trying to murder his heiress wife, accusations that placed him at the center of one of the most sensational social dramas in the 1980s, died at his home in London in 2019 at the age of 92. He is survived by his daughter Cosima and 3 grandchildren. Now, I gotta tell you guys, over the years of doing true crime stories, I feel like I have pretty good radar for the did they, didn't they in unsolved or surprising acquittal cases like this one. But I'd like to ask you, if we think back to our kinda murdery Twilight Zone analogy, which Claus von Bulow do you believe in? Because I'm truly not sure. It seems to me to be nearly as likely that he didn't kill his wife as it is that he did. And so if we think about those 4 different husbands, the loving husband wrongly accused and acquitted, the loving husband wrongly accused and convicted, or the secretly seething husband justly accused and acquitted or convicted, those 4 massively divergent moments in the time stream, the timeline, those 4 that are all the nexus of this one man that truly existed in our reality, in our version of the multiverse. I'd like to know from you. You can reach out to me, kindamurdery@gmail.com, @kindamurdery on all social media, or you can call 888-MURDERY, that's 888-687-3379. Please call and let me know, which version of Claus von Bulow do you believe in? I should mention here that crucial to the construction of this episode were 2 obituaries written in 2019 for Town & Country magazine by Ben Whitcomb, and another written at the same time for the New York Times by Enid Nemi. As always, my sources can be found in the show notes. Alright, I will see you Sunday for a brand spanking new episode. Thank you so much for being here. I am Zevin Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery.